There are so many stories that are just not told. We see a lot of the same stories repeated in Hollywood or on the big screens or in books, but in reality, there's 7 billion stories all around us. A picture can tell 1,000 words, but there's also maybe sometimes a whole other story that you're not really seeing in it. Once you start reading some part of history, there's always another source that almost says the exact opposite. I wanted it to be as authentic as I could make it for a fantasy book. It's not like a college lecture, but it is meant to immerse you into a time and a place that's unlike your own for most people. I had to interweave Japanese folklore and fantasy elements. So there's a little bit of paranormal that I added throughout as like a little bit of spice, but it's based also in true folklore from Japan.
Welcome to Stories and Stanza. I am your host Abhra. I am a poet and I created this podcast to bring you a montage of real stories that make life beautiful as poetry. Some stories are my own and some are from the wonderful people who have chosen to join me as guests and bring their incredible journey. Stories include a creator's passion or unfolding branches of human emotions in the face of failure, or unfamiliar chapters from the past that remind us about the richness and vastness of life. Embark on a voyage of exploration, contemplation, and motivation with me. Please join me in welcoming today's guest speaker. Hi Natalie, welcome to Stories and Stanza. How are you doing today?
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing great.
I'm looking forward to hear everything from you about your new book, your preparation, your challenges, your whole publication journey. And before we get started, could you introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Sure. Thank you for tuning in. It's great to meet you. I'm Natalie Jacobsen. I'm a former journalist, longtime, lifelong writer, photographer, videographer, and now currently also a marketing director in nonprofit and government. And this October, I will be a debut author as well. So that's a little bit about me. I'm based in the United States. I grew up in Oregon. I lived abroad in Japan for several years, and then I moved out to the East Coast of the United States, where I still live today. That's a little bit about me, maybe to get started.
And many congratulations on the first book. So we will read a little bit from the book with you. And before we get to that, can you tell us about your writing journey, how you got started, how you feel inspired, and what led you to writing this book?
So my writing journey started a long time ago. I've always been an avid reader, and I've always been toying with writing creative stories. Even when I was a child or in high school, I was writing creatively quite a bit. Sometimes it was fan fiction, sometimes it was original works, sometimes it was like role plays or D&D with friends. There was always something going on in addition to school. But I really loved world building, creating characters, and giving them tasks or events and seeing what would happen. And then in college, I started studying media relations, journalism, and also Japanese history. And I had some wonderful professors who introduced me to Japanese folklore, Japanese media, and I became very transfixed in Japanese history and culture and literature. And I was fortunate enough to land some work over in Japan. And during that time is when I started exploring writing my first book that was set in Japan based on historical events. Now, at the time, I was in college, so I wasn't fully equipped with my writing skill set or my toolbox, I would say, to take on a story as big as the one I was imagining. But after my time in Japan, I felt a little bit more confident. I had a lot more mastery of like the language, a little bit more understanding of the culture and the history. I had a lot more connections in community that supported and were able to exchange a lot of stories and insights with me. So then during the pandemic, when we all had the downtime a little bit at home, I realized I still had a story in my head that I had back in college. And I thought, well, if I've had this story now for 10 years, why not try to write it? So then I spent a couple of years writing, editing, and then querying it. And then finally last year, I was very fortunate to find the right publisher for it, who was very excited about the story. And now, finally, after 14 years since first inception of the story, it is coming out next month. So that's a little about the journey of this book in particular. That's kind of a broad scope of it. But yeah, I'm happy to dive in more about the process itself,
That
or
is
the time.
wonderful. 14 years is
Thank you.
such a long time to have that story at the back of your mind and finding the right elements to go with that story, I guess. So, tell me a little bit more about your experience and your interaction with Japanese culture. And what I want to hear from you is you are a writer and you're also a photojournalist. So, how do you see these two different creative journeys? So, as a writer, you're doing all this world building and you're creating and things like that. And in photojournalism, you're taking that moment which is telling a story. It's kind of one complements the other. So, I want to hear your experience in that space.
I'd love to talk about it. Thank you. Great question. I have been really lucky to have really incredible roles that, yes, it allowed me to both write and capture things that I witnessed or people who I interacted with. I fell in love with journalism and media because there are so many stories that are just not told. We see a lot of the same stories repeated in Hollywood or on the big screens or in books, but in reality, there's 7 billion stories all around us. And then, especially if you go back in history, everyone has a tale, everyone has a different perspective or experiences life a little bit differently. And we can really learn a lot from each other and break down so many barriers or really erase the borders the more that we connect with one another. And what I love about writing is that I can really get the details of like the context, the history, whereas a photo is a moment and you can get that emotion, that emotive from a person or get the tension of an event. But then it needs the words to supplement and give you the lessons of like what happened, what was the takeaway, who was there, when were they there, what was going on. Because a picture can tell 1,000 words, but there's also maybe sometimes a whole other story that you're not really seeing in it. So I loved having that kind of dual role as both a writer and a photojournalist, being able to capture something and bring back those photographic memories and moments, but then also be able to write about it and explain to the audience why it matters or why looking at this picture is so important.
That is great. When I enjoy photography quite a bit, and I feel like that there are this is like pre-COVID. We used to have a lot of photography groups here in Melbourne, and we used to just walk around the city trying to find those stories hidden. Like Melbourne has beautiful alleyways. Like sometimes all of a sudden, like you are going through the buildings and you go to the lane between them and you see all these artwork, or you see those beautiful cozy restaurants. And it is very interesting that those little pockets of stories sitting within the landscape of the city that usually tourists would miss. Like they will come and see the main landscapes, but they will miss those little bits that make the place so culturally rich, I think. And I've traveled
Yeah,
a fair bit, so I think I can relate to that emotion quite a bit. Coming to the book, can you tell us who the book is for? What was your sort of target readership there?
sure. So my book is called Ghost Train. I first targeted those mostly interested in Japanese history or culture. I at first was writing for people who had some background in it, and then eventually I kind of got so I was working really close with some editors, and I was able to adapt it so that it was a little bit more broad, so that if someone is not as familiar with Japanese history, culture, or language, they could access it and still read it, enjoy it, and maybe take away something from it. I wanted people to have a little bit better grasp of what was happening in the specific time period. I wrote about the Meiji era, the first few years of it, when Japan was kind of westernizing and got a new emperor, and things were both exciting but also changing quite a lot. So my audience is upper young adults. The publisher chose to make it young adults, not necessarily because it's like for younger teenagers, but they wanted it to be available in libraries and accessible to a lot more readers. And it doesn't have necessarily like strong content that would make it feel like an adult novel. However, a lot of my ARC readers and a lot of those who have first read it, beta readers, have all been adults and have all really enjoyed it. And some of them have been knowledgeable of Japan, and some of them have had no knowledge of Japan. And I've been really lucky to hear some great feedback from everyone, and mostly just a lot of enthusiasm. People have felt like they've been able to connect to it regardless of their level of Japanese knowledge or Japanese culture. And that's been really wonderful to hear, because I did want to make it broad for many audiences, whether they enjoy fantasy, historical fiction, or a little bit of paranormal. There's something for everyone, except for romance. There is no romance at all in the book, which might be disappointing to some people, but it's truly a historical fiction that's grounded and has a little bit of speculative or magical realism and a little bit of paranormal, but some of it feels actually a little bit, maybe it's psychological tricks. So kind of leaves it up to the reader to decide what is going on.
That's great. Can you now read anything from your book for the audience so that they get a taste of the book? Anything you like.
Okay. Do you want to give me a random number?
No, that's fine. You pick and choose. You know your book by heart, so uh, yeah.
Okay. How about I read from the first page of chapter 1. So there is a prologue.
Mm-hmm.
I'll skip the prologue for this time because I feel like I shared a lot. So this will give you guys something a little bit exclusive. So this is the first page of chapter 1. Fireworks exploded, and a roar of cheers met the sparks curving downward. Maru clutched a banister, steadying herself on the uneven rooftop under the rosy sky of the bursts, wishing she was flushed with excitement instead of looking pale with despair. With a thump of her foot, her superior Mitsu, a Maiko, motioned for Maru to bring out the sake and mind her tasks. The sculpted scold on her painted lips served as a reminder of Maru's place. She wasn't meant to enjoy Kyoto's summer festival as much as Mitsu and her company did. The geisha and the Maiko sat in a circle on squares of red woven blankets in an area reserved for only a few elite at the festival. In Maru's previous life, she would have been alongside them instead of cowering in a corner with ghosts.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that from your book. And you told me that the book has a context as well, that it is set after a few years, sorry, one century later of Shogun, right? So, do you
Yes.
want to talk about that? Like, what was the preparation for that? Why did you choose it? Sorry, I have not watched it, so you'll have to educate me.
It's okay. Thank you. So Shogun is a wonderful show and a book that is set in a different pivotal time in medieval Japan. It's set around the year 1600, and that was when Portugal, Britain, Denmark, they were really going around the world and claiming land and really instigating a lot of trades and pushing the economy. What they were also pushing, though, was religion. And Japanese leaders realized that they were becoming pawns in European wars and disputes. And they also realized that a lot of their own citizens were losing touch of Japanese traditions and beliefs. And they thought the country is becoming a little bit too Christian. So they actually then closed the borders. They banned foreigners from Japan. They banned trade, although some illegal trade continued at some ports. But for the most part, Japan became a very isolated, closed nation. And then what's interesting is in 1854-ish, American sailors went out to Japan with the intention to reopen their borders because they said, all right, that was cute for 250 years, but you need to reintegrate with the world, basically. You need to be part of the economy. There's things going on. And there was this allure and mystery to this shrouded country that was under kind of lock and key. So Americans went there as they do, and they tried to open their borders and get Japan to be integrated with the world again. And so Japan ascended a new emperor. And about 10, 15 years later, that's when now my book is. And the emperor is really brand new. He was 15 when he became emperor. And in 10 years, his first 10 years as being a leader, Japan went from almost a medieval-ish era to a very modern era where they got trains, electricity, westernization of like education and politics, government, different even nutrition and food. They got trade and the economy, all these things in just 10 years. So it's almost like it transformed this country just overnight. We here in this modern era see a lot of rapid changes in technology. We see things every day, and it's kind of a whirlwind. So I tried to imagine what would someone in the 1870s Japan be experiencing with all these changes right outside their door. There was so much going on in that pivotal era. So Shogun, yes, was a prequel in the sense that it was about when Japan shut its borders, and now mine is what happened after when they reopened their borders and what kind of transformation what happened socially, technologically, government wise, politically, you name it. There's a lot of little things that are covered in the book that follow kind of Shogun a little bit.
That's great. And I have always been a fan of historical fictions that it has a touch of history and it has a new story, and I have always enjoyed them. Coming to your book, so you spent a few years in Japan. You are very familiar with the culture and the history. So, do you want to talk about the preparation for this book? I know you said it took 14 years from the conception to getting this book published, but in terms of research or in terms of gathering any details or the actual writing process, how was it like for this book?
Thank you. Yes, it was intense. And I was fortunate that I had a background in journalism because I felt like I sort of had the tools or the wherewithal to know how to start researching. So I knew some of the major sources to go to, and I knew how to follow these little trails. So I really methodically started looking at broad things like just the history and the wars, the political disputes. And then I went into different lives of generals and leaders. And then I went into cultures about their regions that they were from. And then I went into food and like, what's the history of sushi? What's the history of eating beef or fish in Japan? And the different seasons and the different technology and even the different types of wood that were used over the years. It was a very much this list of like architecture, war, civilization, foods, education, philosophy. It was this whole spreadsheet. I pulled from thousands of documents. I think it was around 3,000 documents, I think is what I wound up reading. It was a different, firsthand accounts. It was different historical books because frankly, also, once you start reading some part of history, there's always another source that almost says the exact opposite. So then you have to figure out, okay, which author is trying to tell you what, where are they from, what's their stances? Is there a third author? Is there a fourth one? And that's the kind of issue I ran into. It's not so much an issue, but it was something I ran into again and again, was that there was always more than one account, as it should be in history. There's always more than one perspective. So there were so many different considerations to take. So then I also had to interview some subject matter experts. So I reached out to a few professors in Japanese language and history, and I had pulled together all my research, and I was just kind of interviewing them to make sure that I was on the right track and that I had interpreted it correctly, and if they had more expansion or other resources I could pull from. And then I also couldn't find some information on some very niche things, like some of the geisha practices are very protected or concealed. So I had to go to a geisha expert specifically to get some knowledge from them, and they graciously shared it with me. I spoke with a kimono designer and artist. I spoke with even an astrologer and fortune teller in Japanese to ask about the history of their fortune telling and how they interpret different moon phases and what would be auspicious or what would be, bad luck. So it was quite a journey to make sure that I was getting the right details and meeting people who were both insightful and then also putting me on the right path, because what I wanted to do was treat this like a journalism project. Yes, it's historical fiction. Yes, it has some fantasy elements, but it really is grounded in real research. It's around real events. And some of the people mentioned like Emperor Meiji is a real person, and I didn't want to do them a disservice or say anything that a reader would take away as like incorrect knowledge. I wanted it to be as authentic as I could make it for a fantasy book.
And are there real characters who are embedded in the book or with the fantasy, or is it purely fiction?
So some of the names borrowed are real names. Like the main character is from a prominent samurai family. So some people will recognize that family name. She did not exist, but Emperor Meiji did exist. Some of the aides kind of existed, the assistants, but for the most part, these are fictional characters who are in place of real ones. There would have been a head geisha, there would have probably been samurai daughters, there would have been historians back then. It was just different names because it's very hard to find individual accounts, especially from civilians. There aren't many surviving works, because unfortunately a lot of cultures around the world, they archive the words of a leader, an emperor or a king, as opposed to a merchant. So unfortunately we've lost a lot of those firsthand accounts over time. But I did want to at least do enough research to bring these characters to life to make them feel both relatable and like they could have existed.
That's really great. From what I have read in the historical fiction space, sort of scene, is that yes, all the documentations are about leaders and emperors and such, but very little documented about common life. And sometimes, like the novels, if they start with the commoner's perspective and then they show that leader, then it takes a very different narrative of history and becomes very, very interesting. So yeah, that's a great job done. um, in the book, you talked about your preparation. What were some of the challenges that you had to overcome as a writer?
The biggest challenge was definitely writing about a time, a history, place, and culture that wasn't where I was or where I'm from. It was, especially when I sat down to really write it, it was 2020 and I was in Washington, D.C. and we were in lockdown. So I couldn't just easily hop on a plane and go to Japan for some extra research. So that's why I relied on a lot of the phone calls and a lot of the Zoom meetings with subject matter experts. But that was probably the biggest challenge, was finding a lot of these historical documents that had been translated or at least also taken from older Japanese into modern Japanese. So the translation stuff was a little bit of a barrier sometimes, and interpreting the materials was a little bit of a challenge. So I was very glad to have the help of subject matter experts and different professors from these universities who were so helpful in pointing me in the right direction and making sure that, yes, I was capturing it or I was interpreting it correctly. Because sometimes when you have limited access to some of these resources, or you can't just go to the place sometimes right away and verify your work, that made it a little bit difficult. Yeah, that was probably the hardest part, was some of the language barriers.
And did you learn Japanese as a language because you stayed over there for some time, right?
Yes. Yes, I was able to be a decent conversationalist. I couldn't go on a talk show and talk about politics. I always feel like that would be the echelon of like, okay, yes, you've learned the language, you know what you're saying and doing. So yes, I at least had some foundation in Japanese. But sometimes when you're reading old Japanese, it's like reading Shakespeare in English, and you're like, what are they saying? Um, so thankfully, there's a lot of sources that have been retranslated into more modern Japanese, and that's a little bit more easy to interpret than the older medieval Japanese. So it's interesting that there's that process that exists, and I guess it exists in every language. There's traditional Chinese, there's modern, more Mandarin, and all the languages I think have an older version that would be a little bit harder to decipher for anybody.
So we now know about the book and your preparation, your work behind that. So it is a historical fiction, and you said it is aimed at young adults. Is there a layered story there through this whole fantasy and the world building that you'd like to share with the audience?
So there was a lot of world building, so much that I did write two sequels. So actually, if I do get, if the sales actually wind up being okay, then we might be able to publish the next two books because there is a lot more to the story. But as for the world building goes, it was one of my favorite parts of it. This book is something that I would consider a little bit of a slower burn because there is some world building. There's a lot of kind of information that's shared throughout at a steady pace. It's not like a college lecture, um, but it is meant to immerse you into a time and a place that's unlike your own for most people. So I had to make after all my research to make sure I was getting the right details. Sometimes it meant walking down the street in like Google Maps. Then also I had to interweave Japanese folklore and fantasy elements. So there's a little bit of paranormal um, that I added throughout as like a little bit of spice, but it's based also in true folklore from Japan. So hopefully it feels a little bit natural when people read it.
Definitely, they will, and I wish you all the best for if you go into that path and those sequels are published. I just want to mention that I've never been to Japan, but I have a brief family connection with Japan.
Oh,
So one
oh
of
really?
the ancestors in my family, so distant relatives, but he was in the International Tribunal after the World War, and he ruled in like he gave his judgments in favor of Japan's war prisoners, how they will be treated and etc. So that's why he's very respected in Japan. There is a statue of him in Japan as well.
There is? Oh my
Yeah,
God.
it's
Which city
yeah,
are
just a beautiful family reference. Unfortunately, I don't know that many details about him. He passed away long before I was born,
mm,
but I grew up hearing about his story, how he, got to that position where he was in the international tribunal committee, and he worked on all this. Uh,
that's so
and
cool. Thank you for sharing. What a small it's
it,
so interesting to meet other people and see what their connections are because yes, there are these exist. We're all
this
one big
exists,
web.
and in this podcast that I'm doing, so there is a uh like I'm talking to writers and creators, of course, and I'm also there is like another segment where I'm talking to motivational writers or wellness speakers, etc. And I want to work on history as well at some stage, as in someone who is interested in history and keen on sharing some of their findings, all these links that you can find through references in today's date. So that's another kind of aspiration for this podcast. So I just wanted to mention that I haven't gotten
Yes.
into that space yet, because it takes a lot of intensive research and things like that. And I'm slowly building that network here in Australia to start at least here. And then I will also bring in the history that I know.
Oh,
Uh,
that is so cool. I applaud it. And I'm really excited to follow your journey too. That'll be a great thing to build
yeah.
upon in this
And
podcast.
I was looking at your references that you shared from your journalism history, all the articles you have written, and that was really great. I guess if we went to that direction, then it will not be focused on it, on the book. So I wanted to keep this episode, talking about this book so that audience who are listening to this interview, they can know what is the preparation they have got a sneak peek of the book cover and everything. So we are coming towards the end of our discussion. So tell me about your publication journey. When did that begin, and where you are at with it? Like, and how was your editing and everything done?
Okay, so it was also very intense. And I was, even though I've been a lifelong writer, I did not know really what was involved in publishing a book at all. I went in almost completely blind. That's my one blind spot. I did not do any research in that. I thought it would be a piece of cake for whatever reason. I was very naive just a few years ago. um, so I had this book that was really 3 books long, and I sent it out to some literary agents, and they wrote back to me and they said, "Hey, this is way too long. There's a lot of genres in here. Can you focus on narrowing down the genre and then also maybe making it smaller?" So that's when I took a break immediately from querying, like about 2 years ago in early 2022, I think. And I broke them up into 3 books, and I took the time to like edit it a little bit more to make it more cohesive in the sense of like, okay, yes, it's a grounded historical fiction with a little bit of fantasy elements. And then I reached back out to a lot more literary agents. I went to a couple conferences. I started connecting with the writing community, and I really learned what it was all about, what everyone's journeys were like, especially during the pandemic. That had really changed the publishing industry quite a bit. And it was very interesting to learn this on the go. And I made a lot of mistakes. And in the end, I did wind up hiring like another editor to help me a little bit with like the pitching. And then shortly after that, I did kind of move away from literary agents, and I started focusing on small publishers. And sure enough, I found the right small publisher, run by a Japanese American family. They were really interested in it. And just a couple months later, I was able to sign with them. So that was spring of 2023. So I was querying it for a little bit over a year with some editing in the middle. And then once I signed on with them, we began the editing process. Again, there were no developmental edits, which I was very fortunate about. It was just a lot of copy edits over and over and over and over again. We did that for a few months, and we finished that. Um, we completely finished that earlier this year in like January or February. And then it's just been marketing and getting it ready, with design, outreach, events ever since. So I can't even believe that I've been signed with them for what, a year and a half now, almost at this point. It feels like it was just yesterday. And I wish I had another maybe year and a half to get ready, but this day for release is coming, whether I'm ready or not. But it's been wonderful to meet other people through promotion, and over the years, I'm still connected with so many people in the writing community who were there early in 2022 when I was getting out there, and they were helping me. And it's just been wonderful to watch everyone's journeys, over the past few years, and see people put books on shelves and share things and just be able to celebrate all these achievements together. And that's probably been the best part of it.
And in this process, have you got any feedback or any testimonial on the book that you'd like to share with the audience?
Yes. Actually, a couple of people who are art creators did share with me their feedback one one reader has already called it her favorite book of all time, and I was shocked. I always thought an author would love to hear that, but I was not prepared for how much that would move me. And someone else has said that they loved it so much that they contacted 5 libraries near them and told them to stock it. So that was incredible. And I've had the fortune of like having other authors endorse it as well. Um, Shirley Miller Kamada called this a wholly unique and remarkably beautiful coming of age story. Eva Wong Neva called it haunting and immersive. And Jake Adelstein, who wrote Tokyo Vice, also turned into the TV show Tokyo Vice. He said that it was the narrative wove together historical authenticity with the ethereal allure of yokai folklore. And he called it lyrical prose that was written. So I'm very touched. I'm very blessed to have so many great readers already and supporters who've had said kind things. So I'm optimistic as someone who suffers greatly from imposter syndrome and confidence issues. This has been a very emotional journey, and seeing the early reviews are just so uplifting and reassuring that like, okay, yes, now was the right time to do it. And I did it in, yes, a way that had a lot of mistakes along the way, but it was ultimately the right way for me and my book.
Wonderful. And I'm sure the book will be loved by the readers, and all of your sequels that you have in mind, they will come out as well. I think I have covered everything that I wanted to discuss related to the book. Is there anything else you'd like to say to the audience before we end up?
Oh, I mostly just want to thank everybody. It was wonderful. Thank you so much for hosting. This was a wonderful discussion. And I wish you the best of luck too. And if anyone is interested in, following my journey, you can find me on social media at Natalie Anna J on most social media platforms.
Yes, and
Thank
yeah, and to the audience, I'll of course put your website and the references so that you can find out more about the book, more about your writing journey. Thank you for taking the time to talk to Stories and Stanza today.
thank you so much.